Thank you. Can you hear me? Good. Okay, yeah, so my background is not on computer science, I will just make this point. So I don't know how to program, so whatever you see is like probably from ACI and psychology perspective. So, but I think this is what makes this interesting, because I was speaking with Marco yesterday, so if you remember the talk of Marco, this might be a little bit like on the other side, like how actually player understand AI, how player perceive AI, and even though this research has been done by me before iGGi, so it's not my current topic, and have a lot of limitation, but I still think that it will bring like some insight, especially for game designer and developer in AI. So back then I worked with my ex-supervisor and colleague, Professor David Thuy, that is currently in Carleton University, and I was working at the University of Reykjavik. And Google Photo reminded me that it's now past 4 years since then, so I start to feel a little bit old. So we know that in video game we can take decision, and that decision will modify what we actually are doing in the game and modify the story. So I bring here the case of Life is Strange. If you play the game, you know that's generally a pretty simple answer. In this case, you can decide if you want pancake or egg and macarons. So seems pretty easy. You don't think too much about that. You say, well, whatever I choose will not actually change much. But if you know this game, when this thing happens, this actually will have consequence, then you start to think a little bit more. Then your perception of agency starts to change. So there are ways in which players actually perceive agency that we might not understand or might be completely different. So our question back then was how actually players perceive agency. And we want to study in an adaptive video game. So I will speak about AI manager. You might also know as AI director. What actually are an AI manager and AI director are basically systems that analyze how players behave, and then will change the game rule in order to adapt to the player and pursue the designer goal. So for example, one of the most well-known cases is Left 4 Dead. So if you're playing Left 4 Dead, every time that you play, you will have a different experience. But because the AI director or AI manager will decide which kind of enemy brings to you, and they will also try to build emotional tension. So different friends will have different behavior, and you will have a different experience. We actually can find it also in other games, for example, Far Cry. In that case, the AI director will add or change the character in open world, but also, for example, in Alien Isolation, they will redirect the aliens based on where you are and which kind of task you're doing in order to maintain a kind of level of intensity. If you want to know more, AI games director, AI talk in YouTube is really good one, so I just took from there. So in our case, we decided to use Mario Kart 3. It's a simple game, you know. But what happened is that basically there is a randomized power-up. So the bonus that you can obtain is based on the difficulty. We all kind of know that. If you didn't know, I'm truly sorry. It's not just because you're good or bad. It's just actually the goal of the game is try to keep you together and have fun with your children or your niece or your family. So in certain way, it kind of try to understand which skill is the player, try to balance the difficulty by assigning powerful power-up or not. Well, we all know this, but it's also good to see some tips. So if you're in the first position, they will give you the banana, they will give you the shell, so things that are basically useful and people can actually avoid. If you're in the last position, in order to help you, it's more likely that you will have a boost. So in order for you to come back to the competition and be able to actually have a little bit of more fun with your friends. So in our case, we try to combine both things together. So David was working on AI director, was asking me, I don't know actually if player understand which kind of system I implement, if this makes the experience better. Can we try to understand what is the experience and if player perceive differently the agency when they know they're interacting with such a complex system. So back then I read a little bit in the literature and I tried to formulate 3 hypotheses to base on experiment. So the first hypothesis was that actually if they were player might perceive differently AI agents in the game, so that they will affect their sense of agency. And then we also noticed that women in general, or like gender-based trend, was in the perception of agency in general in game or like interactive experience. So we have this gender-based hypothesis that they could also change the perception of agency. And the third hypothesis is actually that if it was stated that the game was like adapting to them, the player might attribute more power toward the AI that actually was doing. So I designed an experiment, keeping in mind two different groups. So one was control group, so they was unaware that the system was adapting to their performance. And the second one, it was an experimental group where they was adapting on their performance. Just to give like a small detail, so one of the reasons also because we choose Mario Kart is because Mario Kart is a really simple game. I'm pretty sure that most of you have tried, so they know how the game works. And also, these make like less likely that you will change your idea just based on this experiment, for example. So I measured two main things. One was immersion. Immersion was mostly in this case to ensure that the game was good, because if somebody don't enjoy the game, most of the data that we collect might probably be like compromised or biased. And then I had the agency, that was actually what I was interested to see, what was my hypothesis was based on. So in this case for agency, we define three different subcategories. One was self-efficacy. Self-efficacy came from psychology, particularly from Bandura work. And it was like how players perceive their capacity or they judge the capacity. So is their self-belief to be able to do an action or an intention. The second one was controllability, so how much they was feeling in control over the environment, if they was feeling in control enough to actually do the action. And the last one was effectance. So effectance is like being able to see the influence over the world. So for example, if you do something, if you can see actually the game answering to you. So if you think that you will be able to jump, in effectance, you are actually able to see the jump. So it's something related to the interface itself. So my experiment was devised in two tasks. So the first one, the player was able to play freely. So if he never played the game, or even if they played the game, they tried 2 or 3 sessions, just to try to understand how is the game and get comfortable with it. If they want to play more, they could play more. Because it was really important for me that they have a clear idea what the game was. Then there was like my main task, that was the experiment. So I asked all the players to play 2 rounds. The first round tried to stay in the last position, and in the second round tried to stay in the first position. Of course, based on the capability of the player, that was like as much as they could. This was like to maximize the probability that it was not in something from the AI manager without saying anything to them. Of course, for the experimental group, they was aware because I was like telling them there was this AI director at the beginning of the second task, so they was playing, knowing that this system was existing in order for them to serve them. In the control group, instead, it was say later. This is because I have some questionnaire, and the last was like the interview. So by the time of the interview, everybody was aware of the system, but the experimental group could have noticed something in the game, whereas the control group ideally was not able to perceive it directly. So this is the definition we read to the participant. You will see that it's a little bit obscure in some way. So in the game there is an AI manager that adjusts how the game works in relation to the capability of the player. It's a pretty general definition, I will say. I still think that is interesting because even if it's like maybe a little bit unclear, my dataset was a little bit small and biased. And for bias I mean that was like mostly computer scientists and engineer. There are still people that should be able to understand what is an AI and what is an algorithm. And it's interesting to see like how they still change perception. So I was a little bit ambitious like that. I used different methods. So as I mentioned, I used 3 different questionnaires. The first one was like for the demographic, the second one for the dimension, to see if the game was like enjoyable enough. The third one was the agency, that was my main interest. And then I have another questionnaire that was read aloud as a researcher, and then I invite the player to share the belief and the opinion. So if they think that this kind of situation was happening in the game, to see if it was more likely to attribute power toward the AI manager or not. And then to conclude, I have a small interview that was like based on some specific content to see if actually what I found in the questionnaire was actually relevant. So to double check. So I will pass to the data analysis. So as I mentioned before, I didn't have like a big sample. This is also the reason why my analysis are a little bit limited. There was between 18 and 37. We divide by gender, but I asked, in the questionnaire was open to define their gender how they prefer. So there was also the option to define as other or other label that would feel more appropriate, but nobody used it. So we then divide by each condition at like 7 female and 7 male. And as I was saying, there was a little bit bias in the sense that was mostly coming from engineering and computer science, but I think this makes it even more relevant. And they have both experience in Mario Kart and gaming in general. For the immersion, we find that it was like good immersion in general, so people know Mario Kart most of the time, so also they find it pretty enjoyable. 3.5 on a 1 to 5 like a scale, so this was confirming that they was enjoying the game in general, so it didn't feel like too much as a task. Then we went to agency, that was actually where my hypothesis was. As you can see, this is the mean and standard deviation. There was not much difference. The only thing that was changed is self-efficacy. And in particular, female was having a drop of self-efficacy of like quite 1 point compared to male that was increasing. And we know by Bandura works and other psychology work that this is something that in general happen. There's a gender-based trend of like how they perceive self-efficacy. So it's something that we also have like in other areas that is not just video game or computer or digital games. So we ran a little bit of correlation to try to understand why this was happening, and what we found was like there was a correlation between controllability and self-efficacy. So there was a slight increase for male and a slight decrease for female between the control and the experimental condition. In some sense, this might seem that women was like less sure of their own nature, while men was like reporting to be more sure of what they was doing. And then we find something else in another correlation that was controllability and effectance, and that was like both of the gender have a drop. So you see that male is particularly strong, is quite 1 point, female is a little bit like less strong. So the player was, we suppose that the player was actually not sure how to attribute the event. So they was not sure anymore if it was like because of them or because of the adaptation. So they was not sure how much, like how the agency was translated inside the game. For the last one, the attributional power was actually not possible to evaluate the data. We realized that there was not change visible, and we didn't know enough well the game to actually make any statement. So that part, unfortunately, skipped. The result from the interview. So the interview confirmed what we found. So women was more likely to report a change in perception and feel like they decreased their ability, they didn't feel comfortable enough, while men was like feeling stronger intention to develop a new strategy, and like it was even more like interested to analyze what was happening and try to find a new way to overcome this situation. I will come to the conclusion. So we actually support the first hypothesis that actually if you know that the game is adapting or they have a system that is controlling the AI, you might actually find a change in perception and particularly self-efficacy. That player gender can help to predict perception of agency. I remember this was really limited as research, so it's not representative, the sample. But there was still a gender-based trend that we saw also in the literature in the relationship between self-efficacy and controllability. And the last hypothesis about attribution of power is discarded, not supported in this case. So the two new hypotheses that was come out, I need to rush. So we saw that on a player evaluation, I will say like some, I will not say that it's necessarily based on gender, but like some player might feel like a little bit more recognized and a little bit more excited to play with this kind of system, but other one might feel a little bit judged, like the fact that you analyze them might feel a little bit intrusive. And at the same time, it also lose the kind of conception of what is actually due to us and what is due to the game. So there is a little bit more, but like less boundary in the attribution of the game action. Just a few reflection and consideration. I know that we are a little bit over time. So this is something that is also important for my current research on why player gets stuck, is that you cannot track the game and you cannot just observe people, because there are actually internal state and internal dynamic that we need to understand in order to understand what is actually happening in the game. So in this case, it was self-efficacy, but if you speak with me later, you will see that also in my research about stuckness, there's a lot of things that might not be able to see in the screen. The second one is reflecting about demographic. So something that really teach me this research is that to think really about why we collect the demographic and what can it tell us, because we might make misunderstanding of strong claims. So in this case, again, it's more related to the to reflect about which kind of user they might be, and not just because the literature are always considered female and male, and not other kind of gender, and we always collect them. It not necessarily is like a practice that we should do. And lastly, so there was not any feedback for adaptation. So the problem was a state that was like not integrating the interface. And my suggestion, because it's not an AI, it's something more complex, we might want to mitigate the internal feeling of a player by presenting something that can give feedback and can make understanding what is happening.